Welcome to In Conversation. The next 30 minutes, we'll be speaking with Manal Al-Sharif. And as you've noticed, Brett Solomon, Executive Director of Access Now, is also going to join us for the conversation. As usual, ask your questions, post them in the chat box. We'll try to get to as many as possible. We really love your questions. Now, Manal is a computer scientist and a cybersecurity specialist and activist. She led the hashtag Women to Drive campaign in 2011, trying to push Saudi Arabia to allow women to drive. She is a founder of the Women to Hack Academy, a program that aims to foster tech talent in Saudi Arabia with a focus on information security. She is now using her expertise in cybersecurity to begin a new project called the Ethical Technologists Society to bring together experts to help advocate for more transparency. Welcome to In Conversation, Manal.
Hi, Melissa. Hi, Brett. Good to be here.
So let's just start.
Virtually.
Yes. So let's just start with you talking a little bit about your work.
So my work in activism or my work in cybersecurity?
Bit of both.
Yeah,
they probably
they
overlap,
intersect.
I would say.
Yeah.
Pretty much, yes. So I work in cybersecurity, and it's a male-dominated industry. And working in Saudi Arabia, where most of the internet is censored heavily by the government, I learned how to bypass. I didn't know that was called hacking. That was in '99. And I think that opened the world for me to learn that even blocked places, even censored spaces, whether virtually or like physically, there are ways to bypass them. I think my career was my training ground for being an activist. So I joined the Arab Spring movement in 2011 by starting the Women to Drive movement, actually on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And now I'm completely off all these social media because things completely changed 10 years later.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. Actually, I wanted to ask you about that. How, many of the platforms were your allies, and now I don't know how you would describe them. Maybe not your enemies, but there's a significant cost that you've experienced personally, and I think maybe also for the movement that would be very interesting to hear, like how that changed for you, how your relationship with social media changed, and perhaps also like what you see forecasting to the future in terms of social media for activism.
Good question. So, the Arab youth, we use social media to ignite revolution and topple dictators. And at that time, they didn't use algorithm to rate your post. So people would join those social media platforms because they believed in those causes. They wanted to follow it. They wanted to support it. And it was very organic reach. Like I remember when I opened my Twitter account after I was released from jail for driving while female, I had 10,000 followers at that night, in just one night. And when I posted the video of me driving in the city of Al Khobar, I had around 700,000 views in just one day. I didn't pay ads. I didn't ask influencers to push my videos. It was pretty much organic because we didn't have algorithm at that time that chooses what you see on your feed. Fast forward, Twitter, they had a mule by this, an intern, a Saudi intern that became a mule to Saudi Arabia who leaked our numbers. My number was leaked actually because I linked my Twitter account to my Australian number. And I have a call from the national security on my Australian number. And I'm like, how did they get my number? And then we found out that mule leaked around 6,000 numbers of Twitter users. Most of them are anonymous, been tweeting and criticizing the government and the conservative religious establishment in Saudi Arabia. Some of them are still in jail until today. So people who ran these Twitter accounts, they found out who they are through their phone numbers. Because Twitter didn't have a due diligence of not having a flat network where an intern have access to all the Twitter users. And when the FBI went to Twitter, they went and they told the mule that, hey, FBI are after you. he was in the next flight to Saudi Arabia, and Twitter should be really sued for what happened. I'll mention one name, Abdurrahman Al-Sadhan. If you will go to freesadhan.org, Abdurrahman Al-Sadhan used to run a Twitter account, and he's in jail today. He's sentenced for 20 years in jail and 20 years ban, and because of his Twitter account. So yes, I closed all my social media accounts because now it's being used. The same tools we used for our liberation and find our voice is being used to oppress us.
Yeah, I mean, I think many of us have documented that shift in the way that these tools have worked so actively. I mean, we even was called, the Twitter Arab Spring. That people, wrongly or rightly, there was definitely a sense of liberation. Really interesting that you talk about staff within some of the tech companies as well. This idea that there was, the Saudi Arabian government had planted a staff member to be able to gain access to all of this information, including your phone number and your own identity, and people are in prison as a result. I'm also interested in the kind of gender elements around this. You're obviously such a legend, I want to say, in terms
Thank
of
you.
no, I mean, what you and your community have done in terms of bringing women's rights to the fore, both within Saudi but also in the region and internationally. How do you think that the kind of, both in the positive sense but now also perhaps in that negative sense, how social media and technology is impacting women and particularly feminists who are advocating for political and social change?
Unfortunately, first of all, Britt, you're a star too. I love Access Now work. Like, your work is very important for human rights around the world, and people like me to come and
Thank you.
and really admire the work you're doing.
It's a great team, I'll say, but thank you. I'll convey that. Please go on.
You're an inspiration. Social media used effectively to spread a lot of misinformation. And in Saudi Arabia, it doesn't matter how well-educated you are, it doesn't matter how well-traveled and how well you think you are well-informed. Social media being used to propagate or to the government is using it for their propaganda in an unprecedented way. I don't think governments today, dictatorships and authoritarian regime, found a tool better than social media to spread their propaganda and hyper-target people and show you a reality completely different than the other person's reality. And also use it for surveillance, collecting all this amount of data about us. So social media also being used for harassment. A lot of activists being, I received death threats, rape threats, so much harassment, not only the rumors. It's used effectively for character assassination and terrorizing people when they speak up, when they go online and speak up. And then even the people around you who you grow up with and they know you, your family, your close friends, they start questioning you when they go and read all this amount of lies. The Nazis propaganda is like a lie told million times becomes reality, becomes the truth. And that's what social media does. And unfortunately, because of the engagement algorithm that pushes what causes fear and anger, so all these are the posts and now are the ones that are rewarded. So it really affected human rights, and it really affected getting the truth out. And also the avalanche of information that we get, it overwhelms people, so that you don't even have time anymore
to respond,
to validate.
Validate it. Yeah. And it is interesting, Melissa, the way in which, we've talked a lot this week about disinformation, about the way in which content is propagated via the algorithm on technology platforms. And, this is an instance, obviously, that's happening in Saudi, but we're seeing replicated all over the world. And so how unfortunate is it that activists' response, like Manal's, is like, I'm out of here, I'm out of here, instead of, I can't emotionally or otherwise respond to the content the false content that's coming through.
Tech companies essentially have been co-opted by so many authoritarian states, and it looks like they're winning.
Yeah.
The other side is winning, and that there has been a failure in terms of accountability in a lot of these tech companies.
And the odd thing is as well, and I sort of want to look at you behind and here and there, and Manal, because you're in a big screen behind us, but there you are. But just to say that, in many countries also, like the tech platforms are actually the buffer between the citizen and the state. And so you're in this sort of conflicting position where, like, in Myanmar, activists, in Ethiopia, Sudan, you name a country, activists are desperate to be able to get to a neutral platform, to be able to convey to the rest of the world what's going on. But if it's unsafe, if it's politically unsafe, we know that there are instances, you say, of individuals who are still detained as a result of that leakage. You also mentioned the issue of surveillance. I think it's not just about, sort of content and false information. It's also about tracking.
Right.
And it'd be good to, the other thing that we know is that the Saudi government is not just tracking citizens inside Saudi, but actually across borders as well. So it'd be good for you to talk a little bit about that, about the sort of surveillance regime that you've seen within Saudi and its activities across into different jurisdictions.
And how successful have the Saudis been with their surveillance outside their borders? That's an interesting one.
One of the activists, or the women to drive movement activist who was jailed. I was lucky because I live in Australia. I escaped jail. When she left jail, she sent me a message on WhatsApp and she said, "Oh my God, I couldn't believe she was out of jail." And I was just checking on her if she's okay. And I said, "Hey, don't use WhatsApp. Can you talk to me on Signal or Telegram or Wicker or any of the activists that we use?" And I'm a cybersecurity expert. Like I teach activists how to stay secure online. And she said, no. And this was 2017, 2018, maybe,
Right.
when she left jail. And she said, no. They can see everything as if they are shoulder surfing, as they are next to you, looking at your screen. And I'm like, how? There is encryption. What do you mean? If it's encrypted, they can intercept encrypted messages. She said, no. They use tools that we don't know what, but they showed me messages that we use encrypted channels to send. And I couldn't believe it. And then when Citizen Lab came out with NSO group, the Pegasus.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I have all the, the two-factor authentication on my phone where it has to send me a message. And I was paying attention that my account's been sending me a message from a number in Turkey. So my two-way authenticator, they hacked even my two-way authenticator. And I always change my phone because I know that I've been targeted by Pegasus. And I keep changing, like I keep changing my phone because Pegasus, in cybersecurity, we always teach people, don't click on links from unknown sources.
Right.
With Pegasus, it doesn't work.
Don't even need
they have
to.
the zero-click exploit. I've never had this in my life. And I've been working in cybersecurity since 2002. I'm a computer scientist too. Like I studied 5 years, computer science. So when the activists were telling me, I was still thinking this is like sci-fi. This is not true. Guys, I work in cybersecurity. You're undermining my experience in this field. But apparently we are actually dealing with unprecedented enemy, which is the private hacking tools that being built by some of the top, the Israelis are known to be some of the top when it comes to cybersecurity because they exist in an area of geopolitical unrest. So that's their survival mechanism is to learn the offensive. But when they started selling that, because Saudi Arabia don't have the capacity to create such tools, but now they have the money to go and buy these tools.
And this is actually, and maybe Melissa, you have a follow-up question as well, but I just want to touch on this point about the surveillance trade. I think it's essential that the RightsCon community understands the commerce that's attached to this, the money that's behind this, and it's why we as an organization, together with many others like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have called for a moratorium on the sale of spyware, the trade in spyware, because there's a number of things that can happen if we can put export licenses in place, sanctions in place, regulatory environments, companies, essentially companies are selling and governments are buying. And it's, this call for a moratorium, it also came through the High Commissioner in her statement, which was released this week. Absolutely essential that we both shine a light on this trade and that we also put an end to it.
I think a lot of people forget, perhaps not this particular community, but most or a lot, the majority of the sales of surveillance is still coming from the United States and Europe. China really wants to get in on the market as well, and it's focusing a lot on the global south by undercutting in terms of price what it can offer in terms of surveillance hardware and software. But still, some of the biggest producers of surveillance software
coming out of the democracies.
Are coming out of democracies.
It was good to see the US government did put the NSO group, which produces Pegasus, on its entity list, blacklisted it on its entity list, which was excellent. And I think we've seen the Costa Rican government also now call for a moratorium. It's the first government that's called for it. So I think we're at a tipping point. We need this RightsCon community to really talk to our governments and the companies that are listening that this is actually a trade in weapons. And I think we need to understand it as such. I'm also interested in the role of like the cloud centers and the location of data centers within Saudi. There's been a recent move by a number of organizations to get a resolution at the AGM at Google to say that there really needs to be proper human rights due diligence on the location of data centers, and this suggestion that there will be a data center located in Saudi Arabia. Can you reflect upon that for a second?
It's interesting because I want my country to be prosperous and I want them to have the advancement of technology and enjoy that. Of course, I want this to my country. My problem is not with building a data center in Saudi Arabia. My problem is with Saudi Arabia can buy it from Google, can buy it from China, can buy it from anyone else. So it doesn't really matter who they buy there. There is always, even when you, let's say, NSO group, there's a big backlash against them. There are other 100 NSO group under the table, quietly selling their technology. I think we do need a universal declaration of digital rights that annexed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And all the UN members sign that. So whatever technology that Saudi Arabia or whatever authoritarian regimes end up using, when there are abuses, at least the people who've been, this technology being used against them, they're aware. There's a way for them to tell. Because unfortunately, the US, you talk about NSO group, they bought the NSO group. They use NSO group against its own citizens. So even like it's a very difficult situation where we live today. Democracies abusing their citizens' trust, dictatorships too. Most tech companies, their Northern Star is profit. As long as our Northern Star is our profit will always be over people. It doesn't matter human rights violations that happens because of the technology that we create, as long as our Northern Star. And I think those shareholders, if they're brave enough, shareholders should really say that our success is not only the profit that we make in the next quarter, but actually is, as you mentioned, human rights, due diligence, social corporate responsibility, environmental, all these should be part of what measures success. We can live in a world where the profit drives all our decisions. And I think that is what hurting human rights. That was hurting the planet. That's what's hurting those companies themselves. Because
when are we going to learn?
It's what we're not going to live in this world for long if we still continue doing business as usual, the way we do.
Actually, we're going to get into a Q&A section soon, but I'm wondering before we do that, Manal, if I can take a step back and ask you where things stand in Saudi Arabia, you said earlier that you want your country to be prosperous. Do people there, are they happy? Do you get a sense of to what extent they have access to free information? To what extent do you feel like there's enough dissent and people are unsatisfied? And all of this, of course, is so hard to gauge because of the social media problem. But tell us a little bit about that.
Unfortunately, social media being used effectively to change the discourse in Saudi Arabia and to push the agenda of the government. There is the brainwashing I've been seeing now for highly educated people who I thought they have critical thinking is something I've never experienced in my life, which is very interesting. There's so much distraction happening by opening cinemas and allowing music festivals for the first time in Saudi Arabia and Dakar, whatever. And it's really just that bling that distracts people from the bigger issue, which is human rights, civil rights, political rights that they don't have. There are hundreds of thousands in jails today. No one talks about them. There is just shutdown of any dissent, whether online or in real life. There is this intimidation that happens, it's very clearly happened through. So you don't find really voices. The voices being shut down in Saudi Arabia. It's a sad reality. I do want my country to be prosperous. I do want to have sanctions against the country, but at the same time, people, there's a way to go for people to demand their civil rights and political rights and be part of the decision making instead of just still being treated like children in Saudi Arabia. That decisions been taken in our absence, and we have to follow. And it's a highly educated country. Like 99% of the internet penetration, 99% the internet penetration in Saudi Arabia. Around 99% is the literacy. People are highly educated. They go to colleges. Mostly they study in the US. But they go back to Saudi Arabia, and when you live in that echo chamber, Saudi Arabia use Auspex. If anyone heard of Auspex, Auspex is a behavioral communication company. All the people who left Cambridge Analytica were hired by Auspex. Auspex is owned by the Emiratis actually through a proxy, Egyptian proxy that works for the Emirati government, and they use behavioral communication to change how people think about their governments.
Yeah.
So people, when I talk to them back home, they're happy. They think I'm the ungrateful one because I live abroad. And I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
So
It's
we
funny,
have Middle Eastern Cambridge Analytica, which is Auspex, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying, it strikes such a chord because I think there's a tendency to think of authoritarianism and equate it with a country that is very poor, like North Korea or something. And what we're really seeing is that a lot of countries can be prosperous and authoritarian, can be highly educated and authoritarian.
And high tech.
And high tech, like China.
We were discussing before this idea that, like, you know, the Saudis trying to move away from oil, trying to move into high tech, and therefore tech had traditionally been thought of as like tech, openness, freedom of expression, free flow of data, etc. But this idea about being high tech and suppressive at the same time, which I think the Chinese are kind of, you know, at the forefront of, it's a shift in the way, we're in the midst of a shift in the way that we have to understand, you know, and as coming back to your first point, which is like tech is actually the pathway to suppression.
But can I say one thing about
tech? Of course,
tech?
please. And then I want to ask you about encryption. There's a question or two from the audience, but please.
Tech makes oppression soft. It's the soft oppression. Tech makes the illusion of freedom so real. And that what scares me about technology.
Yeah. There's a couple of questions from the audience. One relates to encryption. Could you give us a sense of like what your message to leaders, the tech companies and within governments is with respect to the importance of encryption? You kind of touched on it before, but it'd be good to expand because, you know, this is the encryption wars that we're still in. It doesn't seem to go away. So like, it'd be great to hear what your key message is.
My key message is China been harvesting a lot of data in the last few years. They've been investing a lot in quantum computing. Quantum computing will actually decrypt the existing encryption. So good luck with encryption.
Yeah, we have talked in some of the sessions here throughout the week about the relationship between quantum and encryption. And, you know,
and it's close. It's very close, quantum computing. We thought it's going to be 50 years until we have quantum computing that unlock the existing encryption. That's not true. It's happening very soon.
Yeah, and one of the things about quantum, I think, is obviously we want quantum encryption, but we don't want quantum computing power to be able to decrypt past things that are encrypted. It will. And so how do we prepare for that? You know, if encryption, if quantum is, you know, 5 or 10 years away, or whatever the actual, you know, the year is, and there's been some recent announcements actually indicating that we will be facing, you know, the application of quantum computing, you know, presently. How do we prepare for that? Like, how do we get ready for, how do we re-encrypt or how do we delete?
You will hear something shocking from me that you won't hear from computer scientists or a technologist.
You heard it here at RightsCon.
I think there are things have to be done in the old-fashioned way, where it doesn't have to be online. It has to be offline. And I think once you go online, that's it, game over. Anyone with the time and money will have access to your data.
Right.
I think that's the next phase.
I mean, that's what I do as a journalist. If I really want to be secure, I meet somebody in person or I write an old-fashioned letter. Manal, I want to get to this question. It's probably a good note to end on. The question is, what can feminists from outside of Saudi Arabia help, or how can they help improve women's rights in the country? So how can the women of the world unite and work on this issue?
I think my dream is we don't have feminists. We don't point out women. That's my dream, but that's maybe my grandchildren will live this dream. How we can help is just to be self-aware. That's the first thing. I think all of us, we need to be self-aware, men and women. And we need to learn to know our fears. Being self-aware and knowing our fears is very important, because sometimes our fears are the ones that stops in the way of speaking up, of when we see injustice, or when we want to demand our rights, when we want to create a long-standing status quo. And I live in Australia, and I see the women even here struggle when they reach positions of power. And I'm like, wow, this is interesting. You have all the rules and policies that support women in power, but you don't find women in power because the culture didn't change. And women can't speak up or don't want to speak up because they're so scared of being pointed, like singled out as troublemakers. I think feminists, not calling it feminist, just being a woman or being a human, it's just being self-aware, learning how to speak up, and learning that the struggle for women's rights anywhere in the world contributes to women's rights around the world. I think that is very important to know, the collective.
Yeah, I was actually going to say, like, I would also like to flip the question as well, which is like, whether you like the term feminists or not, or see the need, but like this idea about like, what can the women, the feminists of Saudi Arabia also teach feminists around the world as well? I think it's hopefully a kind of collective, multi-directional conversation, because, I mean, in preparation for this discussion, I had a look at, some of the videos that you posted in 2011. I watched your TED Talk, and I could see a lot of women in the audience just like, just in awe of what you and your community had managed to, what the feminists had managed to do, what the women drivers had managed to do, not just to the issue of driving, but also how does that impact the society as a whole. And I think that, Roe v. Wade and developments that are happening, it's a constant battle, whether it be on, reproductive rights or LGBT rights, etc. Like we have to continuously learn from each other. And, you've been in a very constrained environment. You're now in Australia. There's so much that we can learn from you, and I think we've already learned from you. And I don't know, I would like to, we will definitely continue this conversation at future RightsCons, because it's so important to the future of our society and the enjoyment of human rights on and offline.
Manal Al-Sharif, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. We're so grateful for your time, and this was a fantastic conversation.
Thank you.
And guys, listen to my podcast, Tech4Evil, techforevil.com. It's about technology and human rights.
You got it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.